So, first of all, welcome and welcome to our external visitors. I see some. Voilà. We launched today this new series of the NarratEUR sessions with our distinguished guest, Frank Schimmelfennig. And I will introduce first, in a few words, the background of this seminar and next our guest. This is the third edition of NarratEUR that started under the aegis of the Belgian presidency of the Council in 24, and the formula has proved to be successful, and that's why it has expanded in the last 2 years. The purpose is to discuss how European integration is built and justified through narratives. Narratives as policy instruments and narratives as the world visions justifying European Union. So we asked researchers from different worlds, of course academics, researchers, but also policymakers and artists. The purpose is to offer a multidimensional perspective on European affairs with the purpose also, the concern to replace what happens today in a comparative perspective, a comparison throughout space and throughout time also. This seminar is an open course, meaning it's first of all a course, and you, the students, are the main targets and the main actors of these discussions. That's why the leader of discussion will act as the first speaker to propose some ways to go further and to ask some questions. And of course, we will have time after that to enlarge the debate for a Q&A session. Another precision, this NarratEUR seminar is inscribed for the next 3 years in our new Jean Monnet Center of Excellence project, BoundEUries. The focus on of this project is to discuss the interactions between community making and boundary making in the European Union. And that's why Frank Schimmelfennig is really the best possible guest to open this collective reflection. Frank Schimmelfennig is a professor of European politics in Zurich, and is also a member of the Center for Comparative and International Studies. He is an associate of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute, and he has also many other institutional belongings and responsibilities. He is a prominent scholar in European integrations, and his contributions have really shaped the debate on a variety of subjects, including for example, the notion of differentiated integration, enlargement, and the discussion on the nature of the European Union. More specifically, in our perspective, he is leading the IRC Advanced Grant project Bordering Europe, Boundary Formation in European Integration, also known as Euroboard. In this project, he analyzes the closure and control of the European Union's internal and external boundaries in the last 4 decades and across a variety of issue areas. And so, relying on a novel data set, the purpose is to explain the debordering and rebordering of the European Union and of the development, the political development of European integration. I will stop here this too short introduction, and we will come back to this in detail, of course, in the discussion. We will start with a talk by Frank for about 50 minutes, let's say. After that, the leader of discussion will take the floor, and we will have more or less 1 hour to go on with the collective discussion. Frank, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, François, for inviting me here and for the kind introduction. Start timing myself. It's a pleasure to be here. When I entered this room and saw the garden and the room, I remembered I had been here like 15 years ago for a kind of talk or workshop on the Eurozone crisis. So at that time, we had very different topics to debate on the European Union than we have today. But I think this shift also say from discussions focusing much more on the internal dynamics of the EU and on financial issues, and now that has, of course, shifted very much to issues of external relations and issues of let's say external and security pressures. So here, a couple of pictures that you're all familiar with that symbolize to some extent the new politics and new issues of European integration. Of course, I mean, studying boundaries is nothing new in the context of the European Union. It's traditionally always been about removing internal barriers and also expanding the external boundaries of the EU. Enlargement has of course always been a topic. The question of where Europe ends, what its external boundaries are, that's been with us for a very long time. But what is new is, they say, the shift in the emphasis of the debate. Now it's really much more on protecting external boundaries against external pressures, rather than opening them up towards further countries. Also, when we speak about enlargement these days, the buzzword is geopolitical enlargement, which had not been around 10 years ago. But I will not go into detail of these individual issues and topics, but my main interest and the content of this talk is to reflect and present some empirical results on how this change also in the external environment of the European Union, how that impacts on boundary formation and polity formation in the European Union. So here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I will present our general theoretical approach, our take on studying boundary formation, which is to look at boundary formation as an indicator for polity formation in the European Union. Then, as a starting point, I will present the EU as embodying a regulatory polity model traditionally, which under these current circumstances has come under pressure, is being challenged in various ways, and the big question then is, okay, how does the EU in its boundary formation respond to these challenges? I will present some of our data, some descriptive findings on how the EU boundaries have reconfigured over the past 45 years or so, and then also present some analysis on what the drivers of this boundary reconfiguration and polity formation have been before I briefly conclude. So let me present our general theoretical approach in this project, which is polity formation as boundary formation. So when we speak of polity formation, traditionally in the study of polity formation, of course, that has focused very much on state formation and on two major dimensions of state formation, state building and nation building. Now, when you speak about the European Union, these might not be the most appropriate terms. We should avoid, say, quickly putting, let's say, a state state concept on what the EU is. So we go for, say, more open and abstract concepts, and we use capacity building and community building. So when we speak about polity formation as capacity building, it's really on the establishment of territorial political authority. It's the establishment of the major capacities that define the state, but any polity, coercive, fiscal, administrative capacities, and it's about centralization of competences and resources. So that's the capacity building dimension of polity formation. That, of course, have been our ideas on that have been very much shaped, say, by the Weberian concept of the state, yeah, with the monopoly of legitimate authority over violence and the idea of a centralized capacity building. The second dimension is more about building a territorial identity, collective identity, traditionally seen as the nation, around, say, collective ideology, culture, and a sense of belonging, and the demarcation of insiders and outsiders. Yeah? So who belongs to the community, who is outside of the community. That is the second dimension of polity formation, understood as community building. So coming to the other concept, boundaries. What do we understand by boundaries? We see boundaries as territorial and functional institutions that regulate the movement of people and products between territories. Yeah. So it's this institutional idea. It's an institution that regulates movement across boundaries, across territories. So this is much more than, let's say, the physical borders of states or polities. It's a lot of invisible boundaries, yeah, that you don't immediately see, but it's the rules that decide, yeah, who gets to move under what conditions, yeah, and what gets to move under what conditions across borders. So we still use a territorial concept of boundaries. Yeah, there's also more open concepts, but it's territorial and functional institutions that we look at. So it's not just one boundary that a territory has, but the boundary varies across, yeah, the kinds of persons and goods. So we have different boundaries for, I don't know, workers, students, researchers, refugees. We also have different boundaries for industrial goods, I don't know, intellectual property rights, other objects. Okay, then we distinguish between two dimensions of the boundary configuration. One is boundary closure. Yeah, that tells us how easy it is for people and products to move between territories. Yeah, we distinguish, let's say, more open boundaries that make it easy for movement, and closed boundaries that make it hard to move between territories. And we also distinguish whether it's about exit or entry, yeah, because the rules for exit are quite different for those of entry, yeah, as I say, third country nationals in the EU know very well. The second dimension is boundary control. Here the question is, who has the authority to regulate these boundaries, the authority and capacity to make and implement these rules. And here we look at legislative competences, executive, judicial competences around boundary control. We look at the administrative, fiscal, coercive, and technical resources in boundary control. And here the main variation is between, let's say, fully national control over these boundary rules and, say, fully centralized, Europeanized rules, supranational rules. So in the next step, we link these two dimensions of boundary formation to the two dimensions of polity formation. We analyze boundary control, yeah, to what extent the EU has the authority and the capacity to regulate the EU's boundaries. We understand that as capacity building in the European Union, whereas we look at boundary closure, yeah, so looking at how open this is inside the EU, but also towards the outside, we see that as an indicator of community building. And here we speak to different theoretical traditions, also in the study of European integration, also in state formation theory, and we tried to make a theoretical contribution to these literatures. Yeah, so in integration theory, very early on, actually, the study of community building and the study of capacity building has actually moved in different directions, with different theories focusing on these two dimensions. So for neo-functionalists, yeah, in the tradition of Ernst Haas, the focus was very much on capacity building as a first step. Yeah. And the measures of European integration that we have also build a lot on the level and scope of integration, meaning to what extent the EU has authority over different policies, and this is what our main measures of integration look at. But early on, there has been a different strand of theorizing on European integration, mainly linked to Karl Deutsch and his what's been called transactionalism, which has really focused on community building, yeah, measuring integration as the density of interaction between people living in different territories, yeah, which is very close to our understanding of community building as boundary closure or boundary opening. And the two dimensions of boundary formation so actually bring these two strands of integration theory together. We also try to make a contribution to state formation theory. So our concepts, our general theoretical take builds very much on the work of Stein-Roccan, who looked at state formation as the centralization of boundary control together with external boundary closure and internal boundary opening. And we look at the European Union as an instance, yeah, of boundary configuration that, in our view, does not mirror what the state has done, yeah, but we can use the same terms and approach to look at how the EU is developing. We're not the first ones to do this. Yeah, there's this excellent book, 2005, by Stefano Bartolini, who already applied this Roccanian take on European integration, and very much in a critical perspective, yeah, arguing that boundary formation in the context of the European Union, yeah, actually does away, yeah, with the state formation that has been achieved by modern European states over the centuries, and is diluting, yeah, these the boundaries of the state, yeah, without say presenting a viable new form of polity. In our project, we also tried to question that a bit. Yeah, is Bartolini really right, or have things moved on in the past 20 years beyond what Bartolini found? Okay, so that's our general theoretical take. Let me now move on to our starting point, which is, okay, the European Union has developed a very specific model of polity in its development, yeah, which does not, let's say, mirror state formation as we know it from the modern period, but we follow here Gian Domenico Maione, who analyzed the European Union as a regulatory state. Yeah? So distinguished that regulatory state from what he called the positive state. Yeah? And so the regulatory state is really about market creation. Yeah? It's about say lowering or removing national barriers that inhibit, yeah, the formation of larger markets. The regulatory state is really about rule making. Yeah, it governs through the legislative making of rules and the judicial enforcement of those rules. And the main idea is to create a level playing field for market actors beyond the nation state. The regulatory state, in addition, is also very much about scale expansion. Yeah? The idea is to develop larger markets, regulate larger markets in increasing markets beyond the state in order to reap benefits, yeah, of economies of scale and efficiency, yeah, from say open markets. So the regulatory state has this tendency to expand, yeah, territorially, but also functionally, yeah, to bring as many policies as possible into this market. It is based on the idea, yeah, that the states that comprise this, say, supranational regulatory state basically need to be rule of law states, yeah, because it's through law, through the rule of law, through regulation that the regulatory state shapes relationships between countries. So you can contrast that to the positive state, which is about intervening into the market, redistributing. The positive state is about capacity building, yeah, not just rule making, but building strong fiscal, administrative, military capacities. It's not just about, say, adjudication, but actually implementation, it tries to, say, demarcate the territory rather than, say, opening up its external boundaries, and it's built not just on rule of law states, but building on, say, national identity and democracy. So here we have quite different visions of state formation, and clearly the let's say the analysis is that the EU regulatory state is what has developed in the 1980s, 1990s in the European Union as a distinct form of polity. That also shapes the boundaries of the European Union, or has shaped the boundaries of the European Union in the following ways. Yeah, so EU boundary formation focuses on legislative and judicial boundary control, yeah, rather than executive authority over boundaries. The executive authority and resources of actual boundary control have remained very much with the nation states, yeah, have not been transferred to the European Union, in the context of the scale expansion, what we would expect is that the EU has mainly engaged in boundary opening, both internally and externally, to expand the market and to reap benefits of scale. And we would also expect to see that boundary opening exceeds boundary control. So it's really about removing barriers rather than establishing centralized authority over these boundaries. Now, the regulatory state comes with issues, yeah, and we frame this as a scale community trade-off. That has been analyzed. Yeah, we were not the first to analyze that, but we take this. So regulatory polity formation and scale expansion come at a cost. Yeah? Come at a cost to identity. Yeah? Means citizens are not seen as, say, members of a thick community based on, say, common ethnic or language or religious traits, but they're mainly seen as market participants. Comes at a cost of democracy. Yeah, it's it's been analyzed for a long time that democracy flourishes rather in, say, smaller scale polities. So there is a danger that the regulatory polity, also because of its technocratic tendencies, undermines democracy. Clearly, the focus is on rules, not capacity. So it triggers or it generates capacity deficits, and also the regulatory state is not about providing security, about defending borders, about protecting, but really about opening boundaries. So it might also come with a security deficit. So that has been analyzed for some time, as say the downside of this regulatory polity formation. We've of course had these debates in EU studies on the democracy deficit, on the capacity deficit. That was first, quite critically revealed during the Eurozone crisis. But these issues have become say much more salient in the current developments, and especially current external developments. So here I just list a few debates in the literature that relate to these challenges to the regulatory polity model. One is the literature we've seen on the geoeconomic turn in economic policy making, also in the international economic order, where we've seen, let's say, the focus on regulation that we've seen in what's called neoliberalism, is being replaced by economic statecraft for geopolitical purposes. There is a debate on, and there is a debate on how that changes the European Union. Then, of course, the military security threats, Russian revisionism, but also uncertainties about the US security guarantees that generates expectations about change in the European polity. The article by Kellerman and McNamara is interesting in that respect. Colleagues of mine and me, we've worked on transboundary crises, putting into question the regulatory polity model in that they expose the lack of capacity of the regulatory state to deal with these crises. And then, of course, there's this huge debate on mass politicization and domestic contestation of the regulatory state. Hoche and Marx constraining the senses is important here, where they actually theorize this identity backlash, that centralization in the absence of, let's say, of democracy and identity building in the European Union might generate. So all of these debates raise questions, and feed into the research question that I want to tackle here today. So the question is, how has the EU boundary configuration responded to these challenges of the regulatory polity model? Do we see some kind of a transformation of this polity model in response to these challenges? And one of the say terms that pop up in different forms in this debate is whether the EU is moving away from the regulatory polity to something else, something that might be a geopolitical union. Geopolitics is definitely the new buzzword that you hear all the time. A couple of kilometers away from here. So our expectations would be, okay, if we should actually see that, we would expect a shift in the EU boundary configuration from the regulatory model to, let's say, more external boundary closure, and stronger external boundary control. And that would mainly be seen in the development of executive authority over the EU's external boundaries and the allocation of additional resources to EU boundary governance. So I will now present you with some descriptive findings first from our data. Don't want to spend too much time on our data set, just say that we've collected data on the EU boundary configuration for the past 45 years, starting in 1980 to 2024. Annual measures for the boundary configuration. We look at 48 different functional boundaries, through which we try to cover European Union policy making quite broadly, broad sets of issues, economic, political, cultural, also military, coercive policies. We look at the movement of the boundaries for the movement of people, different categories of people, but also different products, different objects. Cannot do everything, but we try to have a representative view of the EU's functional boundaries, so that we not just focus, which is often the tendency in the literature, just on one boundary and then generalize from there, but we try to have a broad empirical take on this. Our basic unit of analysis are state diets, so we look at the boundaries between states, between EU member states. That's for the internal boundaries, but also between EU member states and 32 non-members, all the surrounding countries of the European Union, and some important countries outside of the neighborhood, like the US and China, for instance. So for each year boundary diet, we measure the closure between open and closed, and the control of the boundary, and distinguish entry and exit. And we normalize that from 0 to 1. So 0 closure means completely open boundaries, internal market, to fully closed boundaries. And for control, 0 would be national control over boundaries, and 1 would be supranational, fully supranational control over the EU's boundaries. So let's look at what we see descriptively. The legends might be hard to see, so I explain what we see here. I started by saying, well, the regulatory state is really about scale expansion, and that's what we see, especially in the 1990s and 2000s. So the green dots, the green line, that shows the share of all the boundaries in our data set over which the European Union has some kind of authority, where it makes some rules. What we see here is that during the 1990s, early 2000s, this share has massively expanded. At the same time, we see that, and that is the dark line, that looking at those boundaries over which the EU has authority, we see that these boundaries have experienced a significant opening, in the 1990s. So 1990s to early 2000s. So in this period, 1990s, early 2000s, so let's say the height of neoliberalism or globalization, we see that the EU regulatory state has expanded territorially, functionally during this period, and in a way of opening up boundaries, for the movement of persons and products. We also see that in the mid 2000s, this development has stalled. It's been stagnating. What we don't see, however, is, let's say, that the EU is moving towards more closure of its external boundaries overall. Yeah, it's rather stable. Yeah, so this expectation that say of a fortress Europe that would close its boundaries ever more, that's not what we see in our data. Second development I want to show you is okay, what's the relationship between the closure of external boundaries and the control of external boundaries? Here again we see the level of openness of the EU external boundaries has always been higher than the level of centralization of control of these boundaries. Yeah. But we also see that this gap, and this is the right graph, this gap between closure and control has increased massively again in the 1990s, early 2000s. But here again we see that this development has been corrected over time, and we see that this gap is closing. So while the boundaries of the external boundaries of the EU have not become significantly more closed over time, the EU has become more strongly involved in controlling these external boundaries. And while the gap is still there, it has narrowed and is narrowing as we speak, basically. Third observation, this is again in line with the regulatory state model. What we see indeed is if you distinguish between judicial control over external boundaries, legislative control over external boundaries, and executive control. Executive control, the yellow line, is extremely low in comparison with the legislative and judicial authority that the EU has over its external boundaries. So that is basically the idea of the regulatory state, yeah, that deals mainly with rulemaking and judicial control, but is not invested in capacity building or in the actual implementation of or enforcement of these rules, which in the EU still remains very much at the national level. And even though that has increased, yeah, so that there is capacity building, there is more involvement of the EU in the actual implementation of its boundary rules. The gap hasn't really narrowed. Yeah? Even though we see as a gradual increase in EU executive authority. Finally, let's look at the relationship between the internal and the external boundary configuration. Again, I mean, from a state building perspective, the expectation is, well, the state establishes centralized control over the external boundaries, yeah, and then it opens up basically its internal boundaries. Yeah, that's the Rockhan story about early European state formation. In the EU, it's quite the opposite. Yeah, so the blue lines here is always the external, and the red lines is the internal. So when we look at closure, yeah, the left panel, we see that yes, the external boundaries are more closed than the internal boundaries. Yeah, so that fits the general picture, and we also see that in the 1990s, in this period of scale expansion, actually the EU was faster to open up its external boundaries than its internal boundaries. But again, since the mid-2000s, we see the stagnation in external boundary closure that I've shown before, whereas internal boundary opening still continues. So the gap that we should see in successful polity formation between external and internal closure is indeed widening, and shows that the EU is moving in that direction. But if we look at control, we see that the EU very much more controls its internal boundaries than it controls the external boundaries. Yeah? So that's a very different story from state formation. So EU institutions are much more about making sure that the internal boundary rules are centrally enforced rather than the external boundaries, where the member states still have, let's say, much more to say, and have the capacity to enforce boundary rules. Okay, let me come to the, let me just summarize the descriptive findings. So overall, we see a fit, with the regulatory polity model in our data in terms of territorial functional scale expansion, internal and external boundary opening. We also see the gap between control and closure of external boundaries and the gap between executive and legislative and judicial boundary control. We also see, however, that the EU is changing. We see a clear stagnation in scale expansion in the past 20 years, also stagnation in external boundary opening, while internal opening continues. We see that the external control closure gap narrows, and we see a modest increase in external executive boundary control. But still, this doesn't follow really the idea of geopolitical state formation, because we don't see an overall increase in external boundary closure. We see that internal boundary control continues to exceed external boundary control, and we still see a large gap between regulatory and executive boundary control, which tells us, well, basically the EU is not transforming away from its regulatory state model, but it adapts it partially to the new challenges. Now, in the final part of the talk, I want to show you some findings, some statistical findings that look at, let's say, how the community deficits, that I pointed at, democracy, capacity, security, how these have impacted on the changes in the EU boundary configuration. So looking at, I will not go into the details of the statistical analysis. You can question me on that during the Q&A, but just present some results. Here we did an event history analysis looking at the democracy deficit of external boundary governance. And our dependent variable here is the point in time at which the European Parliament gained decision-making authority over external boundary rulemaking. And what we see here is that both the opening of external boundaries and government Euroscepticism have had an accelerating effect on the parliamentary control of external boundaries. So we interpret that as a way in which the EU reacted to criticism about the democratic deficit, especially when it came to the governance of its external boundaries. So the more open these boundaries were, the more there was a demand for parliamentary involvement in decision making, and also this was actually supported by the increase in government Euroscepticism. So we see it as a way in which the EU responded to the democratic deficit by involving the European Parliament more in boundary governance. Second, capacity deficit. Here we look at 4 factors, and we find that all of them were positively related to an increase in the EU's executive capacity over its external boundaries. So here the dependent variable is executive control. Increases in executive control. And we see that these have been positively influenced by the EU's crises. So this is a measure of crisis years. We also see that the more the EU functionally expanded into other areas, the more it built capacity. Territorial expansion is also positively related to capacity building. and also when it expanded its legislative control, this was also followed then by, say, more capacity. So again, we would say, well, the EU has incrementally reacted to its its expansion, yeah, functionally, territorially, and also as a result of crises, yeah, in building capacity. Yeah, as we've seen, the capacity is not still huge, but the capacity building that we see in external boundary governance has been positively correlated with these developments. And then looking at security, as I showed you, we do not see that the EU engages generally in external closure. Yeah, it's rather stagnant. But we see an increasing differentiation in the opening of external boundaries. And what we find is that, okay, this is influenced by geopolitics. We see that the EU reacts differentially, yeah, depending on who it deals with in its external relations. And we see that, say, rivals of the EU, we see an increase over time in the boundary closure, whereas for allies, and it's going slightly down and rather stable for neutral countries. Looking at specific countries, I'd say the most remarkable development is if you look at Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, so that's the yellow and the blue line. In the early 1990s, they were at the same level of external closure. Yeah, the relations with Russia, or let's say the boundaries with Russia, were as closed or open as they were with Ukraine. But over time, you see that they now ended up on different ends, yeah, whereas the EU has opened its boundaries towards Ukraine in a couple of waves, especially after the full-scale invasion. It has very much closed its boundaries to Russia, and we see this exclusion-inclusion dynamic in community building based on this geopolitical challenge. Overall, what we find is that the EU responds to geopolitical challenges, threats, mainly by the means of boundary closure. Yeah, so boundary closure reacts quite strongly to the developing geopolitical threats. So for threat, we actually use an analysis of speeches by European heads of government and state using an LLM to code this as threat perceptions. Yeah, so threat perceptions as we find them in the speeches of EU heads of state and government are correlated with external boundary closure positively. We also distinguish different boundaries as to how securitized they are, and again we find a positive relationship. Also, when we interact the two, we find a positive relationship. On the other hand, we find that the less democratic a country is, yeah, the more closed the EU's boundaries to this country is. So here we find a positive relationship, but then we also used boundary control as a dependent variable. Here it's closure. Looking at control, however, we find nothing. Yeah, so I don't even have to spend time on this. So there's no, we do not find, say, a significant association with geopolitical threats and the extent to which the EU builds boundary governance capacity at its external boundaries. And that, of course, flies in the face of expectations, yeah, based on what's called bellicism, yeah, that the EU would react to geopolitical threats by actually, let's say, external state building, yeah, or increasing its capacity, its centralized capacity to deal with these geopolitical threats. It's really about closure. Okay, so let me conclude. The question of this talk was, okay, in the context of the changing international environment, yeah, the increasing, say, geopolitical rivalries and threats to the European Union, does that change the development of the European Union? Yeah, does it move the EU away from its original traditional regulatory polity template to something that is more similar, yeah, to traditional state building or to some geopolitical union? So in our analysis, based on the boundary configuration, of course you could also measure that otherwise, but that's our measure. We find indeed, yeah, that the EU responds to security and geopolitical pressures, but it has a very peculiar way of responding to it, which is through boundary closure, yeah, rather than boundary control. And here we would argue, well, this is the way in which a regulatory polity responds to geopolitical threats, by, say, altering the rules by which persons and goods can move across its boundaries, yeah, because that's basically the instruments that the regulatory state has. We do not see any relationship, a significant relationship between these geopolitical pressures and external boundary control, and that indeed contradicts the bellicist expectations on polity development. Is the EU still moving away from the regulatory state model? Well, here we would say it is, say, incrementally adjusting its regulatory state model to these challenges rather than transforming. Indeed, we find, say, quite strong effects on external boundary control resulting from general capacity deficits. So here again we would contradict the bellicist expectation that it is military threats that generate capacity building. We find it's a broad category of transboundary crises and the increasing complexity of the EU boundary governance that drives capacity deficit. So it's more of a functionalist story of gradual response to community deficits of the regulatory state, while the regulatory state remains fundamentally intact, but say is adjusted, yeah, by some capacity building to the current threat, but it's still following the regulatory model. Okay. This is where I stop. Finally, I want to say this is all based on teamwork within our projects, contributions of great colleagues that I've had the privilege of working with. These are some of the papers published or close to publication where you will find what I said today in written form if you're interested. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation and your work as a researcher. I had quite a few questions about it. The first one is that your research on geopolitical rebordering led to the conclusion that our geopolitical pressures are not evolving into a centralization of our institutions, but they worked rather on the border openness. Do you think that the models we have today explain this geopolitical shift? So what I mean is, are we in the intersection of liberal intergovernmentalism and post-functionalism, or this geopolitical shift is opening towards a new model? So this is the first question. And then in another article of yours, which is Crisis and Polity Formation in the EU of 2024, you take the neo-functionalist definition of crisis and you make a distinction between failure and attack. And for those of my colleagues who might not know, failure is about capacity development, and he takes as an example COVID, while attack is about contestation of values, and he takes as an example Russia. In both of these cases, citizen support changes depending on whether it is considered a failure or an attack, following his model. Would you say that the Russian-Ukrainian war, in terms of attack crisis, affects rebordering? So like kind of a link between the two. And you said earlier that the regulatory state model works at the costs of values in the EU and identity. Where do you position the concept of rebordering in the normative versus regulatory Europe debate? And is rebordering making a shift away from regulatory state? You kind of answered it because you said we are making adjustments, and also on the side also of the values of the EU, the spread of values of the EU. And last one, this is a particular question about this research in terms of boundary crossing of persons and products. You made a distinction between directly, indirectly, and not security relevant boundaries. And for the indirectly security relevant boundaries, you mentioned researchers in particular. So my question is, how much in your research did the geopolitical pressures affect the mobility of researchers? And that's all. I think it's not too much, I hope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Now your first question was about, let's say, the implications for integration theories and the debate. I mean, as you've seen, I mean, quite in contrast to what I've done in my earlier work, I very much refrain from this integration theory debate, and it followed also quite a few of my colleagues in moving away the debate from integration theories to theories of state formation. But I think it's still, I mean, they still have a lot to say to each other. And I mean, from my conclusions, I mean, I call this a functionalist story. I think if we look at the developments, I would say, well, among all those theories, for me, it still fits best, let's say, with a neo-functionalist story of European integration, because I said, well, the EU has its polity model, the regulatory state, and in line with what neo-functionalists assume is that, okay, changes to this model are incremental, driven by deficits of earlier integration, and I think this is what we also see. I mean, in my interpretation, what we also see here. I mean, the regulatory state has its deficits. These are being exposed by unanticipated events, like the crises, and then the EU reacts, basically to preserve itself as a policy, but also to preserve its policy by making quite incremental rather than transformative adjustments. And that's a bit the story of, I think, the basic story of neo-functionalism. Also fits well with a very popular framework from the crisis period, the failing forward, where, okay, this is also about, I mean, it's not that the EU reinvents itself, in response to the challenges, but also because of its limits in terms of decision making between member states. It typically just does enough to survive and to weather these crises without transforming itself. So I think if you want to translate that into integration theory, then I think it's still closest to the neo-functionalist story. I haven't really paid much attention, but you've seen we've in our models we've also always had a control variable in there, government Euroscepticism, and that of course mirrors the post-functionalist idea that say the more Eurosceptically politicized the EU becomes, the more this limits the EU's ability to respond to these crises with further integration. That's the basic expectation of post-functionalism, that as European integration becomes more politicized, this will create downward pressures on integration and will limit the ability of the EU to integrate further. And actually, we do not find this. So just looking at the different models, here you see that actually government Euroscepticism is positively correlated with empowerment of the European Parliament, rather than repatriating competences to national parliaments. We have a negative effect of Euroscepticism on the capacity deficit. So again, if you translate that, it's a bit cumbersome, but you would say, okay, the more Eurosceptic, the less Eurosceptic, the more Eurosceptic governments are, the more capacity building we have. So it doesn't really make sense to interpret that causally, but what we take from it is that in this period in which we've seen rising government Euroscepticism, the EU was still able to build more capacity. So again, that doesn't really fit the post-functionalist story. And here, with regard to boundary closure, we find no relationship at all between government Euroscepticism and boundary closure, and also no relationship to boundary control. So, I mean, it's just one variable, but I think it's the key variable in a post-functionalist analysis. And we don't really find that the expectation, that the post-functionalist expectation is corroborated. So that is speaking to the other big contender of neo-functionalism. Okay, I'm spending too much time on this. You ask about this distinction between failure and attack. So that's a bit of a different strand of analysis that doesn't speak directly to this paper, but indeed, I mean, if you we see the Russia crisis, the Russian challenge mainly as an attack on the European order and say the European principles and values, and our expectation that we also see in this data is that this will lead to a change in boundary closure, so community building rather than capacity building, and that's what we see. I mean, it hasn't really done very much in terms of centralizing competences in the European Union to the EU level. Just if you look at, say, the response of the EU in terms of defense or energy policies, we don't see that it has created a centralizing movement, giving the EU more powers in defense or energy. There's a lot going on, but it's very much as in defense on a bilateral or multilateral level, also with outside countries, rather than, say, establishing the EU as a military power with centralized competences. What we have seen is indeed this quite dramatic shift in boundary closure, opening towards Ukraine and Moldova as well, while Russia is being more and more excluded. So we would say, okay, this fits our expectations. When it comes to values, as I said, I mean the regulatory state is builds on a rather thin identity of the European Union, and it's mainly centered around, let's say, the rule of law, because the rule of law is centrally relevant for the regular state to function. So the EU regular state can only work, can only function if the member states are rule of law states. And I mean that of course goes to the discussions or the issues the EU has with Hungary and now with a couple of other member states. And it is but say the rule of law of course is embedded into, let's say, broader liberal values. And here again, I mean what we see here is when it comes to boundary closure as an indicator of community building, we indeed see a very strong relationship between democracy, so non-member state democracy, and the kind of boundary openness that the EU has. So I think these liberal values that underpin the rule of law, they are also influential on, let's say, the openness of EU boundaries towards non-member countries, and I think that's the kind of values that also fit with the regulatory state model, which would not work without, let's say, these being underpinned by these liberal values. Then the final question, so of course we categorized researchers as, I say, indirectly security relevant. Probably doesn't apply to us as social scientists, but of course when you work as engineers in robotics or in cyber, then of course you as a researcher become security relevant, and we've seen some EU rules that say make it more difficult to have scientific exchanges and exchanges of researchers with Iran, with Russia, China in these security relevant areas. So just a small remark, but we actually see also an impact on boundary closure for that specific group. Thank you.
I may just take advantage of my position and after that I open the discussion, but I would just like to suggest some tracks, let's say, for discussion, and I am also trying to bridge this session with previous sessions and incoming sessions. Maybe with just a few questions regarding, let's say, actors first. Who is the European Union and how is the European Union acting? And second set of questions regarding the temporal, spatial and political scope of your analysis, meaning temporal long versus short-term range of attitudes and collective representations, and spatial scope, you highlight some case studies, and I refer to your talk and also to your publications. We discussed that a bit before this conference. Many Russia, China, but there is an elephant in the room, the US. And finally, what about IDs? Because you deal with flows of goods and people, but what about flows of IDs? So to come back quickly to this dimension with the European Union. And here I deal mostly with the control dimension, the control of borders. And sometimes we may have the feeling, the impression that you focus on supranational institutions. What about the evolution of the European Council first? The increasing role of the European Council, but also, for example, the suggestions by new intergovernmentalism of a mutation of statehood and a mutation of national state to member states. Or in other words, what happens at national level that may also be influenced by the European Union as a broader political system, and also as a universe of socialization that may create effects by shaping the attitudes and decisions of national rulers, but also of civil society, of NGOs and of citizens. So the infusion, in a way, the indirect influence of European integration at systemic level. So that's the question about who is the European Union, how the European Union is acting, still regarding the control of borders. When we refer to the presentation of your material, of your empirical sources, it's mostly about law. But the European Union is not only functioning through law. Many things also happen through evolution of practices, especially if we consider what happens between member states and in the non-formal politics between national leaders, national actors, even without any direct link with Brussels. So if we take into account these policy practices, and that's also part of the strategy, especially if you are in a functionalist vision. Many things happen far away from the political center, by diffusion, by dissemination. So it may be a way maybe to find other, more evidence of the influence of the European Union, again, as a system of governance. And here we can have in mind what discursive and historical institutionalism is suggesting, for example. The same rules in appearance, but very changing practices in reality. So that's the first question with the European Union and how the European Union is acting. Second set of questions regarding the time dimension and the spatial range of your analysis. And so in this analysis, there is this purpose, this ambition to include the citizens. And really, it's one of your the strong added value of your model, because it's a very ambitious and inclusive model. And it's not that easy to say that of mainstream theories of European integration. So this should be really emphasized. But how to do that? And I don't have the magic answer, unfortunately. But you rely on here on this article we are using as a main source. You rely on the Pew. Well, the Pew does a very good job. It's American. Well, I will come back to this in 1 minute. But it's a global view to compare societies across time, across space. But of course, it offers only a glimpse of the multidimensional aspects of social representations. And sometimes the idea could be to dissociate more the attitudes of public opinions, let's say, in the short term, regarding fears raised by a leader or a regime or a country, and the much more structural perceptions in terms of cultural proximity, cultural affinities or solidarities. And the two may diverge. You may have, for example, let's take the most obvious case, some fears created by the Trump administration, but in the same time a resistance to break free from the traditional transatlantic solidarity. So both dimensions could be maybe distinguished. This is a way to introduce the elephant in the room, the US. And of course, if we take into account the US, it may be an invitation to revisit some of your interpretations, because in a way it's easier with China or with Russia. It's already not easy, and we can find ambivalences regarding these external actors, but with the US it's even more difficult. And to finish, and sorry, I was already too long, but when you refer to geopolitical pressures on external boundaries, two remarks / questions. This is mostly about moves of people and goods. Of course, being what I am and being in the context of this seminar, what about ideas? And sometimes it pops up like that, but what about networks of influence also? And totally connected with movements of goods and people, of course. And again, we come back to the US. This is also maybe a more challenging dimension to advocate this interpretation in terms of control, because the change may occur also within the system, possibly under the influence of external elements. So a geopolitical element may be found also at the heart of the political system and challenge this idea of control. And finally, you focus rightly on the external dimension. But sometimes, and if I understand correctly, this is not in your presentation, so here I extrapolate, but your project deals also with internal boundaries. And in internal boundaries, regarding internal boundaries, we may also find the same dynamics, a way to harden the borders by re-establishment of control explicitly, or with restrictions even regarding the market freedom. And including obstacles to the circulation of goods and people within the European Union. So does it nuance your interpretation, this analysis in terms of internal boundaries? Well, that's enough, and so you can choose what you want to address or not.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, what you did was mainly putting your finger quite clearly on the limitations of our project and our data. I mean, what I've shown you clearly is it's extremely aggregate. Yeah. So this is an analysis basically at the level of the European Union. Yeah. Of course, in general our data lends itself also to look at, say, policy-specific developments or developments for specific countries or specific groups of countries, yeah, which I haven't done. But you could do that with the data. This analysis was not only extremely aggregate, but it was also extremely structural. Yeah, there was no agency there. We just looked at institutional developments over time. So it cannot answer. Yeah, so which actors using what strategies was behind any of these decisions to change the boundary configuration. With that kind of studies, you cannot analyze that. Yeah, for that you would need, rather smaller scale case studies. We also do that. Yeah, we also look at, let's say, the policy process that led from specific crises to boundary changes, and we compare different crises of the EU as, let's say, particularly salient instances where the EU was faced with external pressures, and then look at how these pressures were framed by specific actors in the EU system, what the differences in preferences were between different countries, how public opinion reacted to that. So we do that, but just not in that kind of analysis. So that's a limitation here quite clearly. Also, the other limitation is that in order to do that kind of study, you basically need to rely on formal institutions, law, yeah, because it's just impossible to study practices at that level of generality. Again, that would be something rather for case studies. So I think a lot of your questions relate to these, let's say, inherent limitations of this kind of empirical approach. On the other hand, of course, this kind of empirical approach allows us to study these developments in a say on a very general basis, covering a long time period, covering a large number of policy areas, and covering EU relations with a large number of external countries. So it's that trade-off that we all know, between, let's say, in-depth qualitative work and, say, more and quantitative work focusing more on the, let's say, general trends. So clearly, I think you pointed out the limitations, and you pointed out, okay, what kind of additional studies we would need to better understand what is going on. And I think we've used the focus on external boundaries, mainly because this is where most of the action is currently, and also the external boundaries are the site at which, let's say, this debate on whether the EU builds, let's say, capacity, this bellicist expectation, where this all plays out. It plays out much less in the internal relations. But what we see actually here again, I mean, I've showed you at least some of the differences between external and internal boundary configuration. Overall, again, we do not find that in the current period we see, say, a trend towards more internal closure. Of course, we all have the case of the reintroduction of Schengen border controls in mind. But this is rather an exceptional case. If we look at all the boundaries that we study, we actually find that the process of internal boundary opening is still gradually continuing, and we do not see the reversal. Another limitation I want to mention, of course, is that these institutional changes, these legal changes in the boundary configuration, this is actually a slow-moving process. So our data do not yet reflect current developments, current discussions. In a couple of years, we might see a lot more than we actually see now, because, as you all know, it takes a couple of years in the EU if something happens to see the effects and responses in legal changes. So this is basically looking back a few years, and so some of the conclusions might be premature, and depending on how things develop, the EU might indeed develop in a way that our data currently doesn't show. So again, we need to take this with the necessary caution.
Thanks. My questions were less criticism actually than tribute to the ambition and the range of your analysis. And it was also, and for the needs of the course, an attempt to map some guidelines for incoming reflections. That's why it was important to have you here as a kind of introductory speaker, because we will try to use this cartography to make sense of more sectoral debates. So now we still have 30 minutes for questions. Alors, as I was mentioning, and sorry for our external guests, but we will give priority to students first, and after that we are happy, of course, to take questions by other people. So among the students, please. You can introduce yourself if you want.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very useful and insightful. I am Sara, one of the students of this course. And while one of my questions was already answered about the relationship between internal and external borders, closure. I wanted to ask more specifically about the economic side of this matter, because we spoke about geopolitical threats, and I was wondering how border closure through economics can happen. I was thinking especially about the most recent omnibus regulations of the European Union, which aim to simplify its regulatory nature in order to make the European Union more competitive, and there is a great focus on competitiveness in general in this time period. So I was wondering if the European Union could actually reduce its regulatory nature in the name of competitiveness and economics. And another question is related to the role of the European Parliament, because you mentioned that it has been given more power to contrast the democratic deficit. And I was wondering if in this period where there are discussions about the reduction of veto powers and to give more powers to institutions other than the Commission, which is more centralized, the European Parliament, in this view, could increase its power in the future.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for these questions. You didn't really insist on your question between the development of internal versus external borders, but we've looked at this in other work related to the project, and I think it can also be seen in here. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting developments that we also find in the EU, so you can see when it comes to closure that we see an increasing discrepancy between external closure and internal opening. But with regard to control, what we also find is that external control follows internal control, and that mainly also has functional legal reasons. So whenever the EU acquires authority over the internal boundaries, this immediately raises question whether it should also, for instance, represent the EU in international organizations on the same issues, or whether it, when you regulate the internal boundaries, whether you should not also be able to regulate the external boundaries in the same policy area. And we find basically some kind of a catch-up process that you also find here. I mean that the increase in boundary control, it's the right panel, that externally it's basically run in parallel with the internal developments. So that's, I just wanted to mention that because I didn't mention it before. Now, now you referred to the omnibus regulations. Yeah, I mean, I struggle a bit to relate that to the geopolitical threats, because I think it has much more to do with, say, the internal political shifts in the EU. I mean, it comes under the heading of simplification. Critically, you could also say it's environmental rollback. Yeah. So, and that of course has, in my view, much more to do, let's say, with the political shifts within the European Union. Say from say a center left to the center right and beyond. Yeah, where of course say a very progressive regulatory agenda that we had in the first von der Leyen Commission has now been replaced by basically rolling this back again. Yeah, and I have a hard time relating that to the geopolitical changes. So I mean that also says, well, boundary. I mean. Not everything that happens in the EU is boundary change or related to geopolitical developments, and it it also doesn't run against the analysis or the identification of the EU as a regulatory polity, because if you call it a regulatory polity, it can still regulate in very different ways. Yeah, it can have, let's say, a progressive regulatory agenda, but it can also have, let's say, a neoliberal regulatory agenda, and I think what it still fits the regulatory polity idea what it's doing now. Yeah, of course, the focus on competitiveness, which I'm not sure is really driving this. Yeah, can have a debate on this, but of course the competitiveness agenda, that of course also has geopolitical implications, but. Again, I hesitate to make that link. Also, what we've seen is that the geopolitical pressures have not really played into the hands of the European Parliament. Yeah? I mean, crisis policy making very much driven by external events. It's rather been a mechanism to sideline the European Parliament. Yeah? That would be my take from observing what is going on.
Okay, maybe we can take several questions to avoid the back and forth with the micro. Students are still the priority target. Is there none? No. You can enlarge maybe. Okay, so non-student questions? Former student questions?
As you wish. I can go first. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Salle Bora. Like, I work at the VUB, so 20 minutes away. And I had 2 points. One of them is like not really a question, it's just to add something on something already discussed and brought by François actually. So I will say that like one example of like, you know, when like sort of part of the biases of looking law to measure bordering is that, like, for instance, as a third country national, one thing I could say that the EU visa policy has been completely overhauled in the last 10 years. But this has not shown up in the law, for instance. Like basically one example is waiting times. And I suspect that like in trade, there will be stuff like this as well, for instance, you know. That was one example, like waiting times is a good metric. Another like more specific question, like I really look forward, by the way, to the data set, which I saw is going to be published in European Union Politics. Another issue I had was a bit like basically the findings, very compelling findings, by the way, are shown as sort of like an indication that bellicist models of state building are not sort of working. So essentially that the EU is not state building as a response to geopolitical threats that are like from other states, essentially, like say Russia and so on. And I mean, like to me, like the issue I might have with this is that in my understanding, the bellicist argument does not necessarily say that the EU is going to do state building because of external threats. It's also possible that the EU actually fails to do state building because of external threats, because the bellicist argument, like as developed by the Kellerman-McNamara article, like I think they actually do give a big role to the path dependence of the regulatory state as well. So for instance, like, you know, what shows up in the data, like it is very well also compatible, in my view, at least with what they say. It's just that I think their diagnosis differs in the sense that, like with Euroboard, I think there's a relatively more optimistic or measured diagnosis saying that like sort of this idea that Europe, like I mean, to make it very simple, that Europe fails to become a state. Like I mean, Euroboard nuances that because it's less state-centric, while the Kellerman-McNamara argument, it's more state-centric. It's the idea that basically to succeed in international politics, you need to become a proper state, like the way I understand the bellicist state-building argument. And to me, like the data does not show that this is not the case. Because like, for instance, from the domains that I know, at least in industrial policy, including in defense industrial policy, like the fact that there's no sort of centralized capacity building is actually like sort of leading to like dependency towards US producers, for instance, in defense, because it's difficult to sort of create a demand shock and consolidate European defense industries. And likewise, sort of there's a ongoing movement towards deindustrialization in the German industrial heartland, for instance. And it's actually pretty difficult to address without sort of like a set of more centralized tools. At least like that's my perspective as well. So my sort of counterpoint will be that like the data does not show anything against the bellicist argument. It just shows that, as the bellicist argument also expects, the EU is developing on its regulatory trajectory. But then I think like there's an added degree of like a more optimistic diagnosis that this regulatory trajectory is fundamentally okay, that the data, in my view, does not show. So like I think it will be something to touch upon without claiming that this trajectory is not working or is working. Probably it's more complex than like a yes or no answer, but yes.
Thanks very much for having external guests here. I'm Scott Hamilton. I'm from the University of Antwerp. My question is kind of similar. It's also about the non-finding with relation to capacity building. I wondered if it wasn't related to the nature of the EU, like that the EU isn't a state, and so we shouldn't expect it to act like a state by centralizing command. It's a club. And as a club, you expect it to do other things in order to achieve capacity. You expect it to be on the orchestration side of things in the Abbott et al. 2019. You expect it to be providing incentives so that the club members will do the things that they need to do so that the public good gets produced in the end. And for me, to expect the state to be centralizing command was more like a Leviathan approach. It was more like something you would expect if, for instance, the people had taken over an existing apparatus and were trying to defend it, but which isn't the case.
Okay, thank you, Salle. Thank you, Scott. No, I mean, I think this is very interesting, and I think it also introduces some nuance. So, say my engagement with the bellicist argument was basically taking the cue from the Kalaman and McNamara piece, which says yes. I mean the EU because I mean. Our starting points are quite similar, yeah. So because the EU has developed as a regulatory market-making polity, it has these deficits, yeah, and these deficits is something that the regulatory state as such cannot overcome. Yeah, it's basically bound to this trajectory. Except, yeah, they say, well, once you have a military threat, yeah, then that would basically be the only way in which the EU changes tack and transforms itself and, embarks on this path of capacity building and state formation. Yeah. So now, of course, one can debate whether this moment has arrived, yeah, or whether it's just not, whether the signal is still not strong enough. Yeah. But I guess with the Russian aggression plus the transatlantic security crisis, I think this is as close to this moment, yeah, where things should happen as it has ever been in the development of the EU. It's still early days. We have to see what is going on. But I mean, our point is okay. First. We actually, I mean, in reaction to this security crisis, to this threat, we actually don't see the EU transforming itself into this this state. And the bellicist argument, of course, is from Tilly saying that state formation is driven by external military threats. Yeah? Now we have this external military threat, but we do not really find that state formation. Yeah, and one of the reasons is what Scott said. Well, the EU is a different polity and reacts differently to this. It's not that nothing is going on in that respect. There is capacity building, but the capacity building takes place at the level of the states. Yeah? And with, as you said, some incentives from the EU through SAFE and other instruments, but it's not centralized capacity building. It also goes beyond the European Union, involves the UK, Turkey, maybe other countries, Canada, maybe, who knows? Yeah, say the coordination of much of the military action still takes place in NATO. Yeah, so this would be my main point. On the other hand, we also have an issue with the bellicist argument in saying, well, military threats are not the only drivers of capacity building. We see limited, but we see some capacity building also in reaction, let's say, to more general transboundary crises. Yeah, we see it in reaction to the financial crisis, to the refugee crisis, so, I mean, this bellicist focus on military threats might just be too limiting in the case of the EU. So these are our 2 points, and of course, as regards the domain of industrial policy, you know a lot more than I do. So I take your points, yeah. I think I basically responded to what you said, and I'm very much in agreement. I mean, if you call it a club or a regulatory polity, I mean, addresses different things. But I think the logic is very similar here. That given the nature of the EU, the expectation is that it will engage in this capacity building very much in a regulatory way, facilitating coordination between the member states, giving incentives through the budget, but not building the capacity itself. And I think this is a major difference, let's say, towards how I would interpret the bellicist expectation.
Case, I may have an extra one, and it's a way to warm up for what is in store for us after. And it's all about comparison again, because we try to have a kind of standardized approach with all our guests, and in order also to sketch an analytical framework in the wake of this course. What about the comparison again, and what you described for the European Union? To which extent can it be compared to dynamics at work in other political systems, meaning other political systems in present times, or maybe other political systems from the past? I will not say for the future, but if you want. Voilà. No, mais this dynamics between in the management of borders, is there something really singular or even specific in the case of the European Union regarding the nature of this political order? It's a very broad question, and I am aware of this, so it means that you are totally free to offer an answer or no answer, but I think it's an important question, at least in our collective reflection. It's also a way to take a critical distance, and we need some critical distance these days, and maybe to appease fears also regarding what we are living now.
Yeah. Okay. So you invited me to speculate. I will do that. Now, I mean, the typical comparison that we use in the EU is with the development of other federal states. Yeah. So that would be the historical comparison, because I think the comparison to other regional organizations is very difficult because of the specific nature of the EU. But I mean, if you look at the development of federal states, I mean, probably the Swiss case is the one I know best, but of course we can also look at the US. I think it's not so uncommon, yeah, for federal states to start with, let's say, a rather decentralized, loose form of organizations. I mean, we also take a lot of inspiration from the studies of American political development, yeah, Skowronek and others, who have also shown, yeah, I mean, it's the US of the early 19th century has been an extremely loosely integrated entity, and it also took a number of crises, yeah, say external challenges, of course the wars with Britain, and also the anti-colonial engagements to develop into, say, a more centralized entity. Switzerland also, I mean, it's still today quite decentralized, but in the 19th century was a confederation. Now, what I found remarkable is that in these states, which also, say, operated very much at a regulatory level, were law states to some extent, that the development of fiscal capacities and military capacities came a lot earlier, yeah, and were basically leading the development of centralization. I mean, of course, we have the Hamiltonian moment in the US, the need to have an army to fight Britain. Also in Switzerland, the organization of a federal army was also something that happened not immediately, but rather quickly after the establishment of the federation in 1848. So and also the theories of federalism that we have, they all say, well, what really makes a federation, what really transforms, let's say, a loose, decentralized polity into a federal state, has to do with security, has to do with military engagements. Either you need to have, a strong external security threat that motivates the independent entities to transfer powers to the center, or you need to have one of the members of the federation to act as a federator based on superior military power. Yeah, think of Prussia in Germany, think of Savoy in Italy, yeah, as let's say internal federator. So it's all very much driven by security threats, and so this kind of federalist theory is very much in line with the Bellicist theory of state formation. And if you look at the developments in these countries, one of the foremost things, yeah, that the federations did was indeed, yeah, to say organize an army and back this up through, say, some fiscal capacity. So I'm not an expert, but my amateur reading of the history indeed tells me that this is something that's very different in the European Union, where, let's say, the military centralization, if it ever happens, probably going to be the last thing that the EU does, not one of the first things that drives the centralization. And of course, that has to do with the fact that the EU is composed of states, yeah, that have developed that capacity in the past, and I wouldn't rule that out, but this capacity doesn't need to be first and foremost created by the European Union, and the European Union was never intended as a way of the member states to create that capacity. So here I see quite a bit of a difference in the historical trajectories, but I'm open to other input from the audience, because that was mainly a bit of historical speculation.
It was not only speculative, because indeed federalism was a primary suspect, and there is a kind of revival of federalism now in the political and intellectual debate. We had recently Fabrini or Enrico Letta. They are also advocating an updated version of federalism, also in functional terms, even Mario Draghi to some extent. So it's not just a fictional topic. Well, the other possible candidate, but we will not enter into this dimension, is the imperial model. It was fashionable some years ago, it comes back periodically, but it's just something that we leave for future sessions. If we don't have the last minute and key questions that you were keeping for you, no, that's okay. No, I think that we had quite a productive and rich discussion, and for this we can really say a big thank you to our guests. Thank you very much.